Let's shoot this fucker.
Hello, I'm Hot Toddy, and welcome to an all-new and very special episode of Get Real. Why is it special, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. It's the very first ever Get Real exclusive episode. In this episode, we're going to do something a little different. Normally, we talk about a singular film and discuss, all about it, whatever. In an exclusive episode, we'll talk about the entire catalog of certain people, like actors, or in this case, directors. That's right. So we're going to talk about some of the films of one of my all-time favorite directors. You may have heard of him, but most likely a lot of you probably haven't, unless you're a cult film follower like me. I'm talking about the one and only Edward D. Wood Jr., as you can see by my hat. Edward D. Wood Jr., better known as Ed Wood. A few weeks ago on the Smokin' Hot Toddcast Live, I made Miss Pingrino sit through one of my all-time favorite films, and the film that Ed Wood is most known for, Plan 9 from Outer Space, whose poster you can see right behind me. It's right back there. That's why I have it angled up like this so you can see the Plan 9 poster, as well as our beloved flying saucer that we made in the same episode. This isn't one of the actual flying saucers from the film, but there's some company made a model kit out of the flying saucers from the film a couple of years ago. I found one on eBay, and on that particular episode of the Smokin' Hot Toddcast that I'm talking about, called Building Plan 9, we built one of these flying saucers, and so I have that prop here with me now. Oh yeah, and then there's the thing that says what episode it is and whatnot. What are you looking at? So in this episode of Get Real, we're going to talk about the works of the one and only Ed Wood. And what's interesting about Ed Wood is, I said it a few minutes ago, you probably never heard of him. And the reason why you've never heard of him is because he made some of the worst films ever made. Now, that's kind of an ironic term because the truth of the matter is he didn't make bad movies. He made entertainingly bad movies. If you're somebody like me and you appreciate schlocky, like bad B movies from the old days, or even bad movies from today, you would get a kick out of Ed Wood films, because that's basically all his films are, just schlocky goodness, just stupidity. It's one of those situations where the director's heart was in the right place, but we're not sure where his brain was, because they don't have the ability to create whatever art it is that they're trying to express to us. You know what I'm saying? That was Ed Wood's problem, and really sometimes even I feel like that's my problem sometimes. Like, I usually have a huge idea of how I want to do episodes of this show, or Stump Hot Toddy, or Just the Dumbest, or even the Smokin' Hot Toddcast, and I execute them, and they still turn out great, but it's not to that grand scale. Well, imagine if you got some kind of a budget. You got just enough money to produce a film, you try to produce the film, but it looks awful, and you have to show this to, you're my YouTube family. You're my little YouTube family. The Toddcast has its own podcast family. Imagine trying to convince the world to accept your art. That's hard enough to do when you're a Francis Ford Coppola or Martin Scorsese, because you never know, you could make a flop. But imagine being Ed Wood and your films not only flop, but barely see the light of day. And that's basically what he went through. I still look at him as an influence, really. I have always enjoyed his films. I think they're a great example of what not to do when to make a movie, and all you have to do is just watch one to understand that point. He would usually do one takes. He would use horrible props, as you can see by this little flying saucer. He wouldn't take the initiative to create something interesting, to make people go, wow, those are amazing special effects. He always felt that the story would stand on its own, and that the special effects was like a side benefit. It was something that you weren't really paying attention to because you cared more about the story, the plot, and the people in the film. And while that is true to a certain extent, even in the 50s, you wanted something that would wow you. When thinking about doing this episode about Ed Wood, I kind of got into the history of filmmaking. And when you think about it, by the time Ed Wood hit the scene, which was in the 1950s, the motion picture industry had been around for about 40 years at that point. You think about the 1910s. The movie industry was basically just to put stuff out there and entertain people, really to wow people at the, look, wow, the moving picture, look at this. We can do plays on a screen and not live. The 1910s was basically like, let's do this thing. Let's put out the motion picture. And so people would be entertained by a potato rolling down a hill. Then came the 1920s, when finally artistry came out, and you saw some extremely interesting films. You would see like Nosferatu. Even though it was meant to be a horror film, and it was in fact a very scary film, you could see a lot of the artistic liberties. You could see what they were going for. One of my all-time favorite silent features, The Phantom of the Opera, extremely artistic. That was the original Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. You saw so many different amazing things. Then the 30s came around, and that was basically wowing you with films with sound. Wow, we can hear, not only can we see these things move now, we can hear them speak, we can hear noises, and that was basically the wow of the 30s, was the talkie era.
I am Dracula. I bid you welcome. Listen to them. Children of the night.
Then the 40s rolled around, and that was like the first decade of the broad interpretations, the huge productions like Gone with the Wind, like these films that may not necessarily have amazing special effects, but they were built on a grand scale, and they could just wow you just by looking at them. Then the 1950s rolled around, and the film industry kind of went on a plateau, if you will. And what I mean by that is because by the 1950s, we were in the middle of the Cold War. We had just wrapped up World War II. It was the baby boomer generation. A lot of people had a lot of disposable income. The economy was doing really well. So people were just trying to get stuff out there for people to enjoy. And I like to think of the 1950s as sort of the birth of the original major blockbuster. You hear about the blockbuster, the blockbuster films. Not talking about the video store. We're not renting videos here. I'm talking about the industry. That was really the era of let's see what movies could get out there and make a ton of money. And that's where movies that you see on this show right here, Mystery Science Theater 3000, were born because they really just put out anything. Especially since we were in the middle of the atomic age. Of course, the bomb had dropped in 45, so, you had a lot of monster movies, but they weren't horror monsters, they were disaster monsters. They were giant bugs and, giant people, Godzilla, you saw these giant monsters and things like that. And that was sort of the transition into the 50s. Not to mention the fact that we were just coming off the heels of that particular incident that took place in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. So the other thing that was fascinating people, including the nuclear age, was the possibility of extraterrestrials. They thought aliens existed, so why not? Let's do a bunch of films where aliens come to Earth. So the 1950s were shifting from kind of in the modern era of how we know films today. You still had the artistic, stylized films, but the type of movie that you would want to go see on a date, the type of movie you'd want to go see with the family, it was the big blockbusters. It was the films that were going to wow you and entertain you while you ate popcorn. And that's basically how the film industry is today. It's the films that will wow you, like Avengers and Star Wars and stuff like that. So Ed Wood tried to do something that I think made him ahead of his time. This is why I'm a big fan of his. His style was an even blend of artistry with the idea of making a big blockbuster. The problem with that is that nobody knew who Ed was, and nobody cared who Ed Wood was. They didn't care who Ed Wood was and what he was doing, and so that kind of caused a lot of issues for him because he wanted to make films so badly. It was all he ever wanted to do, But he really couldn't do it due to the fact that nobody would really finance his films. No one would give him the shot that he desperately wanted, and I believe he deserved. So he did it. He went out and did it on his own. He went out and independently made films and got them financed by financiers who really he conned into the job. I mean, a lot of these movies were a con job. They really were. God bless him for what he was trying to do, but he pulled a fast one on a lot of people. But hey, he got the job done. But he was able to make some films, and they weren't great. Like I said, they're a mixture of artistry with the things that we were interested in the most at that time. When you think of Ed Wood, you think of 3 films in particular: Glenn or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, and of course his magnum opus, Plan 9 from Outer Space. There it is again, Plan 9 from Outer Space. That film really is the film that people remember him the most for, but those were his top 3. He made some interesting films. Again, each film had a point. They were all films that were trying to tell a specific story, and stories that were trying to warn us. And that's why I'm saying, we're going to get more into that in a second, but he was so ahead of his time. I wish he'd seen what happened with his films, because they really were ahead of his time. But anyway, so he tried to get these movies done. It just wasn't happening. Lo and behold, though, he did manage to make friends with one major celebrity. And if you're an Ed Wood fan, you know what celebrity that is. I just impersonated him at the beginning of the show. Bela Lugosi. That's right. A very elderly Bela Lugosi at that point. He was not in his prime anymore. He was not getting the jobs that he used to get. He was not Dracula, anymore. He was not the guy that we knew and loved from Dracula and all the other big horror films that he did in the 30s. He was on the outs. But God bless him, he was still trying to work. He was still trying to get out there and make things happen. So, he was doing his thing, and Ed Wood befriended Bela Lugosi. Now, there's a lot of debate whether or not, again, because Ed Wood, as much as I like him, the dude was a con artist. He could scam the pants off of you. And a lot of people think that this was also a con job. He was not actually friends with Lugosi. He just made him think he was his friend so that he could, exploit him and use him for his name. And it worked too, because I mean, if you're not familiar with Ed Wood, but maybe you're familiar with the titles of his movies, or maybe you've even seen 1 or 2 of his movies, it's because Bela Lugosi was a part of it. That name draw is what made these movies a little bit better than what they were. But I, and a lot of people, and I'm included in this, believe that it was a legitimate friendship, that Ed Wood was a positive role model in Bela Lugosi's final days. He was somebody that he desperately needed. Somebody on his side of the table who was rooting for him and wanting him to get back out there and be, the Bela Lugosi that we all knew. And even though the movies that Ed put him in were awful, it still brought out the good old Bela Lugosi that we knew from 20 years before. So it was fun to get to see him in that atmosphere. So he had the idea, he had the star, now he had to implement the film. He had to get it going, and that was never easy. And that's where he got them privately financed. And again, this is where he kind of became a con man, because he would promise things and offer things that he could not hold up on his end of the deal. But whatever. But the movies got made. That's the point. And that leads me into the ultimate point in my review of Ed Wood in general. The man was a visionary. He was a master storyteller. He had an interesting concept for every film that he ever made. The problem was, it was laughingly, hysterically under budget. Every film he did had such a low budget, it was embarrassing. And so the story, and the story itself was also so convoluted that the message would be hidden too deep and people just wouldn't get it. And that was the problem. And that's why I say he was ahead of his time, because I think we would appreciate films, the type of films that he made now, than back in the 50s. Back in the 50s, people just didn't care. They didn't want to hear a special message. And, there's people today that also don't want to hear the special message. They just want to, eat popcorn and watch a movie. That's fine. What I'm saying is, I think we would watch these films with more of an open mind. But nobody, not even free thinkers, not even people like me probably back then, would have given Ed Wood the time of day. But all of his films, like I said, have a special message. Films like Jailbait and shit. Films like Jailbait and The Violent Years are films about teenage angst and what could happen if you don't teach your children properly. They could grow up to be horrible delinquents and destroy their lives. The Sinister Urge, a movie about the trials and tribulations and the scariness of joining the pornography industry, which is ironic because that was in Ed Wood's future. More on that in a bit. But again, as I said earlier, when you think of Ed Wood, there are 3 films proper that people associate him with. Those films are Glen or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, Plan 9 from Outer Space. And I'm going to start off by talking about Glen or Glenda. It's Pride Month after all. It's June. Of course, you know that from our last episode of Let Me Tell You. But this film is extremely important, I think, for today's generation because it's a film about being transgender and the fears of letting people know that you're transgender. Ed Wood plays a man who dresses up in ladies' clothing. He's a cross-dresser. This is his love. It's his passion. He's not a gay man. He is a straight man. He loves his girlfriend, but he doesn't know how to explain it to her. He doesn't know how to tell her that he enjoys dressing up in women's clothing. Finally, he admits to her that he does this. And though she is hesitant at first, she does accept him. And it really is a touching story. Again, the movie is wackadoo. It's filled with all kinds of weird elements. Bela Lugosi is in it as essentially God. He's saying, pull the strings, pull the strings.
People, all going somewhere, all with their own thoughts, their own ideas. Pull the string.
He's pulling the strings of life and making people move and dance. It's a whole thing, and it's very weirdly done. I say it would be accepted today, but again, in Ed Wood's style, it may just be really too weird for people. But the message was clear. It's all about acceptance and love for people who may not think or do the exact same things that you do. And that's a huge part of today's society. And so that's why Glen or Glenda would have been an amazing message to have in the 21st century. It is an amazing message, although we don't use it that much as part of the message, again, because the film is batshit crazy. But again, the element is there. And that's what makes it an interesting film. The next film is Bride of the Monster. What makes this film so interesting is because it really is a huge part of the 1950s. It's a quintessential 1950s sci-fi B-movie. It's all about the atomic age. Originally it was going to be called Bride of the Atom, but the producers of the film didn't think it would work, so they decided they convinced Ed Wood to change the name to the film Bride of the Monster. And it's all about nuclear power and about the horrible things that nuclear power can do. Bela Lugosi is in this one as well. Tor Johnson, who was also an Ed Wood regular, was in it, and he plays his loyal henchman, Lobo, which is a name that follows Tor Johnson in most of the movies he was in. I don't know why. But anyway, it's all about, like I said, it's all about the atomic age. Bela Lugosi is doing horrible experiments with nuclear power, and it all leads up to the grand finale of the film, Bela Lugosi being killed by his own creation, a giant octopus that has been made giant due to nuclear power. So Bride of the Monster is it's a warning about nuclear power and the use of nuclear weapons and things like that. Plan 9 from Outer Space, again, his magnum opus, the film that everybody would know. If you know Ed Wood, you know this film. Plan 9 from Outer Space is the film that, again, it has an interesting message. Where Bride of the Monster has kind of a dated message that people probably wouldn't pay attention to very much these days, Plan 9 from Outer Space, another very relevant message. It's about the concept of the film. If you watched it with us, of course, on the Smoking Hot Toddcast Live, you know the point of the film is that aliens have come to Earth because they need to destroy Earth. They look at Earth as too dangerous to be left alive. They need to destroy humanity. And the way they're going to do that is with Plan 9.
Ah, yes. Plan 9 deals with the resurrection of the dead. Long-distance electrode shot into the pineal and pituitary glands of recent dead.
Turning them into radioactive zombies where they go around and killing the living. That's the plan to destroy people. Again, this is why Ed Wood's movies probably wouldn't make any sense even today, but the reason why I'm talking about them is because the message was there. It was about humanity destroying itself.
We did not come here as enemies. We came only with friendly intentions, to talk, to ask your aid.
Our aid?
Yes, your aid for the whole universe. First was your firecracker, a harmless explosive. Then your hand grenade. They began to kill your own people a few at a time. Then the bomb. Then a larger bomb. Many people are killed at one time. Then your scientists stumbled upon the atom bomb. Split the atom. Then the hydrogen bomb, where you actually explode the air itself.
These aliens come to Earth to take out the planet before we take out ourselves, or worse, take out other planets in the solar system, in the universe. And so they come to Earth to stop us, essentially, from blowing ourselves up or blowing up other people. So the message basically is, put down the weapon, friend. Please stop killing. Please stop killing yourselves. Don't kill us. And again, a very relevant message for the 21st century. But again, these films that Ed Wood did, horribly and hilariously low budget, and the message gets muddled under all of this nonsense.
You see? Your stupid minds. Stupid! That's all I'm taking from you. Get back here, you jerk!
No big deal. The point of the film is the story. People will pay attention to the story and ignore all those little aspects, which really is probably rule number one. It's 101 in filmmaking. But again, I can't blame Ed Wood for his feelings, because he believed that the story would prevail. He believed that the story was all that you needed in a film, and the production of it really wasn't that big a deal. It was sort of secondary compared to everything else. Even in the 1950s, that wasn't true, and he didn't really realize that until he put his movies out there. And so that's what happened to him. He did all these movies in the 50s, and they were forgotten just as soon as they were seen. As he got into the 60s, he still tried to make some films, some horror films. They just did not work. I also own a copy of the film Orgy of the Dead, which I look at as the missing link between his two careers of making legitimate horror films and making his next venture, making pornography. See, I told you we'd come back around to this. That's right. By the 60s, he was almost completely broke, and he would take any kind of directing job that he could get. By the late 60s, early 70s, something that was becoming very popular, pornography. And so he went into pornography and started making porn films, a couple of which you can actually buy online. There's one called Take It Out and Trade, which is basically like a pornographic comedy. I've never seen it. This is one of the few films of his I've never seen. I've not seen his porno work. The only film that I've come close to seeing that's slightly pornography is Orgy of the Dead, which again it's a horror film with naked ladies. That's basically all it is. But yeah, as time went on, he gave up on his aspects of being the next Orson Welles and just slipped completely into pornography. By the late 70s, he was completely broke and was a horrible, horrible alcoholic. He was drunk all the time, and it was a problem that was never getting better, and sadly died of a heart attack at the age of 54 in 1978. Never knowing just how big of an impact his movies would have, because once we got into the 80s, people started rediscovering Ed Wood and rediscovering his films, most notably Plan 9 from Outer Space, which won the Golden Turkey Award. It was one of the first films to win the Golden Turkey for the worst film ever made, which is not true. It's the most entertainingly bad film of all time, because it's a film, if you watch it once, you're going to want to watch it a million times. It's hilarious to watch. It's unintentionally hilarious. It's a lot of fun to watch, and it's one of my all-time favorite films. Throughout the 80s, some of his films started getting rediscovered, and in 1987, as a matter of fact, a film was discovered that was never released called Night of the Ghouls. It was sort of a pseudo sequel to Plan 9 from Outer Space, but it had the old Ed Wood crew in it. Everybody was in it with the exception of Bela Lugosi, who had passed away by that point. And it's a pretty good film too. I own it on DVD as well. And then by the 90s, people were really starting to get back into Ed Wood, most notably this show, Mystery Science Theater 3000. They did a couple of his movies on that show. And then in 1994, the great director Tim Burton did a biopic film about Ed Wood called Ed Wood. Now, it's not a straight-up biopic about his life. If you've ever seen it before, it's very flamboyant. It's very, it's very Tim Burton. It's very Tim Burton-esque, with crazy, sets and crazy attitudes and personalities of all the actors in it. It's an extrapolation of what happened in Ed Wood's life. In fact, the movie ends before all the tragic stuff happens. So it looks like a happy Hollywood ending. It really wasn't. But it's a great film. Johnny Depp plays Ed Wood. He does an amazing job of it. Johnny Depp had to do just create a voice for him. This happy-go-lucky voice. I'm gonna make movies, and it's really fun and entertaining, and he does a great job at it. And it's a cavalcade of stars. Martin Landau is in it, playing Bela Lugosi. Sarah Jessica Parker's in it. Then Patricia Arquette is in it. Bill Murray's in it as his good friend Bunny Breckenridge, who is in Plan 9 from Outer Space. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's a great, great film. So I highly recommend checking out Tim Burton's Ed Wood. It's a fantastic film. Overall, Ed Wood is still, I think, a cultural icon, even today. He was not an icon during his time, but we remember him fondly. People like me who love bad B movies, who love the idea of creating something, and even though you really don't have the ability, you still go ahead and do it. And that's what Ed Wood was about. And that's what I love about him, is his determination. He's like, I know I don't have the funds to do this. I know I barely even have the means to do it. But damn it, I'm gonna do it. And he did it. He made his films. He made the films he wanted to make. They did not have the impact that he wanted, but by golly, he did it. And you know what? It didn't work for him back then, but it works now. And we look back on Ed Wood as a bad film director, yes, but I look at him as one of the greats because he accomplished what he wanted to do. And he made movies with interesting messages in them. Again, Glinda Glinda is a film that I think if people watch, they would get. It'd be like, wow, okay, this is a guy who's struggling, and he has to come to terms with this, and he has to admit to the people he loves that he is not the person that they think he is. How is he going to do it? And then he finally admits, I do this. I am transgender. And it's what happens, and they accept him for it, and it's a really a powerful message done on a very low budget and not really good way, but it works. It's a film, and that's the thing about Ed Wood. I don't think I mentioned this, that he was in fact transgender. He cross-dressed. He loved Angora. He loved Angora sweaters. He would wear them while he was shooting films. He would wear them in his private time. Obviously, in the 50s, he couldn't really go out and do that, but he loved Angora, and he loved women's clothing. He was not a gay man. He just loved to dress up as a woman. And again, that would have never been accepted during his time. God knows his film Glinda Glinda didn't get accepted during that time, but he would be an icon today, I believe, because he was not of his time. He was ahead of his time. He belongs with us here, but unfortunately he was back there, and so he didn't get to see the success and the impact that his films and life had on all of us. But we deeply thank Ed Wood for what he did, and bringing his films to light. And now I own them. I get to watch them all the time, and I just love him for it. Obviously, I wouldn't sport a hat with his name on it if I didn't love the guy to death. I wouldn't have a poster of his most famous film if I didn't love the guy. Sure, his films may have not been great, but I think that is the charm of them, and the quality speaks for itself in not a good way, but the entertainment also speaks for itself, and that is in a huge way. And that's a Get Real exclusive on the late, great Edward D. Wood Jr. I hate to play on one note, I really do. But there's only one way to end this episode.
Your stupid minds! Stupid! Stupid!
That's all I'm taking from you.
Get back here, you fool!